We do have a special musical offering for today, and given our time, I realize I'm on a tight schedule. I realize that the Rams kick off somewhere around 3:30 to 3:40. I want to honor your time, even though I don't care who wins the football game. And so we're going to go ahead and begin as the last folks are coming in. We are blessed today that Marilyn Manning has a musical offering for us, a tribute to America from the piano. And so think about it like a Sunday morning worship service. Continue to greet one another with a holy hug or a holy handshake, while we also enjoy a musical prelude from Marilyn Manning. Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you, Marilyn Manning, for getting us off to a rousing start. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Stuart Gordon, Associate Pastor here at San Marino Community Church. I'm thrilled that you are here for our first 2026 edition of America at 250, our Sunday seminars for this year. I am thrilled to have with me Dr. Jesse George Nickel, who's a member of the congregation and an American historian, Dr. Ron White, whom you may have heard of before. himself an American historian and published author who's working on his next book right now every morning. He's the first person here on campus writing his book on John Quincy Adams. And so be looking for that. If you did not get the chance, we had a check-in table there. I have a lot of contact information for folks who were here in October. And if you were here in October and left your email address, you don't need to worry about that. If you were not here in October and would like to be on our email list, be sure to stop by the table afterwards so we can get your information. Secondly, the books for sale are Walter Isaacson's book, The Best Sentence Ever Written, which Ron has recommended. It's a brief little, it's a book about one sentence. How long can it be? So it's an 80-page book, real small pages, and that will really prepare you for next month's gathering, which will be on March the 15th. Beware the Ides of March. Next, on March the 15th, where we will consider that phrase that all men are created equal. Today, though, Ron is going to get us started with some remarks about the religious perspective on the American Revolution. You have his handouts in front of you. If you don't have one, maybe you can raise your hand in a moment after I get away from the microphone, and we can bring one of those outlines to you. I believe that's all the introductory information I need to offer, other than an opening word of prayer. So let us pray. Eternal God, we thank you for the reality of the created order, that you make us with names and you put us in particular places, in families, in states, in nations, and that the way in which we live out our faithfulness to you is through concrete relationships in real places. We thank you for the United States of America, for 250 years of this land. Thank you for all the bounty of this land and all its blessing. And we acknowledge to you the ways in which we are not yet the people you would have us be. Guide us in this season ahead as we consider what it means to be faithful, to be good citizens, and to bear witness to the Lordship of Jesus, even in the doing of it. We pray in the strong name of the Trinity. Amen. I always wonder how much of an introduction I should give to Ron White whenever I stand up here. There's the risk of saying too much, and he's a modest man, and you know him already, but there's also the risk of saying too little and failing to acknowledge what a gift he is to the American History Guild in this country and to this congregation and community. We're grateful that he's generous with his time and is happy to come and share from his research to this church and to this community. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Dr. Ron White.
For those of you who thought you were coming to hear the Declaration of Independence, I do have some good news. On Thursday of this week, the state of New Jersey decreed, starting on Friday, that 3rd to 5th graders will now learn cursive. And why will they learn cursive? The explanation was so they could read the Declaration of Independence in cursive. So that's the good news. So we will get to the Declaration of Independence, even if we do not quite get there today. When Stuart and I first talked about this months and months ago, we debated, well, what would happen if the Rams were actually playing on January 25? And we sort of took bets. Would they not? Well, they are, but fortunately it's at 3:30. I've also been asked by a number of people, including this morning, is this event being recorded? We do not live stream it because my experience in a variety of settings is that when you live stream something, 1/3 of the people won't come. But if you record it, then you can watch it. So it is being recorded, and it will be up on our website on Tuesday or Wednesday, and we're grateful to Jonas and his team for putting that up on the website. 2 weeks ago, I thought about how I might begin, but I can't begin that way. I was born in Minneapolis. I grew up there as a child. My grandfather, who I never met, emigrated from Sweden. He walked the last 400 miles to Minnesota and married the farmer's daughter in 1896. I say this because I'm very worried about our own children and grandchildren in this sense. Abraham Lincoln, at age 20, talked about what he called the silent artillery of time that is taking away the memory of the revolutionary generation. And I worry that our own children do not have any understanding of what took place in World War II, how this nation came together, how many of you have experienced walking in villages in France where people will walk up to you right on the street and say, "Thank you. Thank you for coming to save us." We seem to have forgotten that in the last few weeks and years, and it's really important. My Uncle Edgar, my mother had 6 brothers, the only girl. Uncle Edgar lied about his age and enrolled in World War I at age 16. Uncle Vincent served in World War II. Decades later, I was asked by the president of Princeton Seminary when I was serving there, could we begin to start some continuing education away from Princeton in some other part of the United States? Where should we begin? I said, Minneapolis. It's a great city. And so at the great Westminster Presbyterian Church on the Nicollet Mall, we began a continuing education again every year, attending the Guthrie Theater. Well, as a child, my mother taught me how to pray in Swedish. I wish I could do it today, but I won't try. And in English, and we prayed the Lord's Prayer. My favorite uncle was Uncle Ewald, this great big Swedish man. And so one day after I was about age 6, I guess we were praying the Lord's Prayer, and I got to this place where I said, "Deliver us from evil," but I said, "Deliver us from Ewald." And I said, and I said to my mother, "What did Ewald ever do to us?" So those things can happen when we pray. The real focus of these 5 Sundays is going to be asking the question, by what lens do we participate in 2026 in America at 250? Whether we're aware of it or not, there's all kinds of lenses. If you go on the internet and put America at 250, you will see all kinds of different organizations doing what they want to do. I was approached some months ago by the Heritage Foundation, the foundation that put together Project 2025, and asked if I would participate in their America at 250. I read their letter to me, which 3 times in 2 paragraphs told me that we were an exceptional country, and then said, and we don't want to talk about slavery. That's not what we want to talk about in 2026. And I decided I could not participate in that project because that would not be honest about who we are as Americans. So the first way we might participate with a lens of history is what our president is calling patriotic history. Patriotic history. Did you read that on Thursday at the National Historic Park in Philadelphia, the place where George Washington served for 8 years as President of the United States, the National Park Service arrived to take down the plaques that were there? Because the plaques lifted up the true story, the ironic story, but the true story that George Washington, this great man who deserves our praise as the founding president, also, as the American Revolution, Ken Burns' documentary says, owned slaves. And he had 9 slaves with him in Philadelphia for those 8 years. So the plaque simply talked about the dilemma, the inconsistency of both freedom, which the Declaration of Independence says, and slavery at the same time. But the Park Service arrived to take those plaques down because we don't want to talk about that in 2026. And if you go online, I wish now I was using the screens, all these people have arrived with their own signs where the plaques used to be. Don't whitewash history. Let's be honest about America. At the end of 2025, probably not noticed by most of us, I can't pronounce it particularly, in Margraten, the Netherlands, this was the final resting place, is the final resting place for 8,300 American soldiers who fought in World War II. There were two displays there. It recognized 172 black troops that were buried in the Netherlands. But the order came to take down the two plaques that were there because the signs said that these American black soldiers with their heroism did not yet fully enjoy freedom in America because of the desegregation that they faced when they returned to this country. Take those plaques down. They are not part of the new patriotic history. But what surprised people was Netherlands, after again and again and again and again, are filing into that cemetery to propose their objections to this, to say, this is not true. This is who they were. Tell the story honestly, please. This is patriotic history. It is one lens. Fortunately, it's not the only lens. Now, the second word on your handout, you'll excuse my sophomore and junior German learned at UCLA. I'm going to try to pronounce it, maybe can help us. Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Oh, there, I tried. I heard this word when early in the Obama administration, I received a telephone call one day. You remember when people used to telephone you. And the call came from the State Department. And it said, would you be willing to go to Germany and speak about Abraham Lincoln on behalf of the United States? What had happened was in Europe, all across Europe, because of the war in Iraq, people were staying away from American embassies and consulates in all of the European countries. And the State Department said, I think we could hopefully start to bring people back to our consulates and embassies. How would we do that? They said, would you be willing to talk about Lincoln? I said, why Lincoln? They said, well, that's soft diplomacy. That's soft diplomacy. So I went to Germany and spoke in Hamburg, Münster, and Berlin. And when I was in Berlin, I thought I'd take the opportunity. I walked down the great street there to the large state museum, and they had an exhibit on Hitler and Nazism. And I wondered to myself, are they going to whitewash this? How are they going to interpret it? They did not. They put up every single evil part of Nazism. They did not try to reinterpret it at all. It was all right there. And this was the word by which they used Vergangenheitsbewältigung. What it means is we have to cope with our past. We have to become honest with our past. Now, interestingly, in the first Trump administration, the gentleman whose name is escaping me, and that may be good, he's now the head of the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., was the ambassador to Germany. And he said to the German people, get over it. Nazism was only 12 years. Get over it. Why are you still talking about it in your schools? Why are you talking about it? And the German people were outraged by this. And Angela Merkel said, we will never get over it, nor should we ever get over it. And we cannot use the excuse that I was not born. This is part of our nation's history. So in one sense, and I think the American Revolution by Ken Burns does a good job of this. If you watch it or you will watch it, Cynthia and I are watching it for a second time, there's ways to criticize it. We might have said this or that. But what I think it's attempting to do compared to earlier versions is, do you notice how they lifted up the story of the Native Americans? That George Washington isn't this marble god that never made a mistake. No, he often made many mistakes as a general. There are voices of women in this series, not just men who were the soldiers. So this is a way of trying to reclaim our past with much more honesty. I'll come back and say more about the documentary. But I'll say it now. The one thing that the documentary doesn't do, and it really surprised me, there is what my great Princeton Seminary colleague, Dr. James Loder, used to call the presence of an absence. The presence of an absence. There is literally no mention of the role of religion in the American Revolution. Unbelievable to me. They chose a group of historians. They could have chosen others. There was a whole group that emerged in the 1960s, Harry Skip Stout at Yale, Mark Knoll at Notre Dame, what I'm looking at my own handwriting here, at Wake Forest, who lifted up this story, but it's absent in the story of the American Revolution. So I want to talk about that story today because I think that's a lens by which we need to understand the American Revolution. Sometimes Ken Burns does, and I understand this, he often picks out those people who are really kind of interesting voices. They're fascinating kind of figures. I'm not sure they're the best historians, but they're fascinating figures. And so we've missed the whole story of why the American Revolution was undergirded by the amazing story of Christianity in America. I'm not talking about white Christian nationalism. I'm talking about Christianity in America. So let's look at this. 200 years later, in 1818, this is in your handout, John Adams asked, but what do we mean by the American Revolution? Do we mean the American War? The revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people, a change in their religious sentiments and of their duties and obligations. So we want to talk this afternoon about what was that change in their religious sentiments that in many ways would force forward the American Revolution. In 1760s, Joseph Galloway, a loyalist and Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly, asserted that the insurrectionary spirit in the colonies was led by Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and smugglers. During the American Revolution, an English politician, Horace Walpole, charged in Parliament, "Cousin America has eloped with a Presbyterian pastor." Well, what they're saying was, at that moment, there were two dominant Protestant denominations, Congregationalists and Presbyterians. They were by far the largest groups in colonial America. A British soldier during the American Revolution said, "This is an Irish-Scotch Presbyterian rebellion." Well, why so? So our question is, what was the change that took place? Well, I'm suggesting three observations. The transformation of Puritanism from Old England to New England. Now, Puritan or Puritanism was really a word of derogation leveled at these dissenters by the Church of England. They were purifiers. They wanted to purify the church. I studied for 1 year in England while I was in my late 20s, and I caught this sentiment as I studied within an Anglican theological seminary. The most awful word I learned was enthusiasm. Americans are enthusiastic. These Presbyterians are enthusiastic. This was the Puritans were poor, bad people. They were denied acceptance to Oxford and Cambridge. They could not go forward in their jobs. This past week at Fuller Seminary and at Monte Vista Grove, through Terry McGonigal and Suzette McGonigal, we had the privilege of hearing the president of an evangelical Protestant seminary from Kyiv, Ukraine. And he talked about this. He had grown up in Russia, and as he went to school, children would wear something red on their clothing, indicating that they were followers of Lenin. And if you were not, you could not go forward in your higher education. You could not go forward with a job. And the most amazing thing to us as we listened was that Protestantism in a country that's mostly Orthodox and some Catholic is really booming. His seminary has 750 students, 3 times as many as Princeton Seminary, because they're looking for something that can transform their culture. And this kind of reformed spirit is what it is. So in America, at the time of the American Revolution, I list this here before you, 3/4 of those who were Christians were Congregationalists, Presbyterians, German Reformed, Dutch Reformed, French Huguenot. There would become a great Catholic presence in this country, but that really began in the 1830s. That began with a huge Catholic immigration, and then later on a Jewish immigration later in the 19th century. Secondly, these Puritans came to the United States as dissenters. They had not had full privilege in England. And so they had learned from bitter experience what it meant to oppose an establishment, both the state and the church. And they did not want to exist in that environment. Some of you were here in October for our seminar, which we called the Separation of Church and State. And at that time, I announced that in July, there was a ruling by the IRS that we would no longer bar ministers talking about politics or political candidates from the pulpit. Is this something we want? Since that seminar, those on the far right have said over and over and over again, the separation of church and state is a myth. It has nothing to do with American history. They have decried this and said we should not separate the church and state. So if you look at Kristi Noem's edicts or Pete Hegseth, they're filled with Bible verses right from the beginning saying this is a white Christian nationalist country. No, the separation of church and state was exactly what these people wanted because they had experienced a land where the church was established and they were disestablished. So the separation of church and state was very important to them. Not that they were against religion, but that no one religion would dominate. And finally, and completely missed in the American Revolution documentary, I'm sorry, Ken Burns, I have great respect for you, was what was the point of the documentary, which is, one sense true, is that the colonies, you remember, are all divided. They couldn't get together. They were all separated. But that's not true. There was one great intercolonial movement. It was called the Great Awakening. It was the awakening of revival from 1720 to 1760, led by Jonathan Edwards and others. It went from Massachusetts to Georgia. This was the first great intercolonial movement. It was not a political movement. It was a religious movement where people joined together. They wrote letters back and forth. They were so excited that this awakening was happening all through all 13 colonies. Fascinating, the person who really was the leader of it was an Englishman, George Whitefield, but that doesn't make any difference. This great intercolonial movement was a religious movement before there was a political movement. And many historians who were not part of the documentary would have said to us, that was the foundation by which colonies began to communicate with each other and began to work together, because it was religion that bound them together before politics bound them together. Politics divided them. Religion united them. So I'm going to suggest here this afternoon that there are actually maybe 4 parties. They weren't locked in parties, but 4 points of view, maybe we could say, about the American Revolution, all founded within the Christian faith, all offering their own perspective. The first I'm calling the Patriot Party. These were basically the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians. They were the overwhelming number of people who supported the American Revolution. Jonathan Mayhew, in the midst of the stamp crisis, you remember that if you've watched the documentary, said, he preached from Galatians 5:1, we are called into liberty. And he explained what liberty might make. It wasn't simply for individual liberty, it was for the liberty of the colonies. There was a theological analysis going on by the Patriot Party that tyranny and oppression grow where there's lack of virtue. Are you listening to what I'm saying? Where there's lack of personal virtue, tyranny and oppression grow. I remember the first time I spoke and was accosted literally at a Presbyterian church in Westlake Village, the Presbyterian church, and I was speaking about Abraham Lincoln. And at lunch that day, I had used the word civility. I said, well, Lincoln is a 19th century person. We can't replicate his ideas necessarily, but he has certain values. And one of his values is civility, that we ought to treat each other with respect, that we ought to listen to each other. And at lunch, the pastor's wife attacked me. She said, civility, that's a liberal word. We don't need any civility in this country. We need the truth. Well, I was sort of taken aback. I didn't know exactly what to say. I've learned in recent months that empathy is now the bad word. Empathy is a bad word. We don't want to have empathy for immigrants. We don't want to have empathy for the other. That's somehow a weakness. The word is force. The word is power. The Patriot Party understood that oppression rises when we've lost personal virtue. A fascinating person in this story is John Witherspoon, the only minister who ever signed the Declaration of Independence. Presbyterian, Scot, came to be president of Princeton University. It was then called the College of New Jersey. It would change its name not until 1896. And presidents of colleges in those days were also professors of moral philosophy. So John Witherspoon came out of Scotland, where he had been persecuted, where he was a dissenter, and he came to this nation and he served Princeton, and he talked about moral philosophy. He'd experienced English oppression. He used an interesting word, dominion. He said dominion belongs to, first, God alone, but dominion also among people only exists when we have a social contract, when we agree with each other, when the people agree with each other. Not the king, but the people agree, and so he became the only minister to sign the Declaration of Independence. Well, the second party is what I might call the Reforming Party. And I'm not a fan of historical analogy, but you might think of yourself, are these parties existing today? The Reforming Party was not as numerous as the Patriot Party, but it was worried that we were focusing simply on British sins, and it asked the question, wait a second, are there any American sins? Is there something wrong with us, not simply wrong with them? It's so easy to find a scapegoat. This is what the Nazis did. The Nazis said the scapegoat is the Jews. What is the scapegoat that we are using today not to reflect upon our own sins? So they pointed out that we had an American sin. What do you think they called the American sin? What would you think that might have been called out? Slavery. Slavery. Even in the 1760s and 1770s, the reformers said, don't just focus on the British sins, let's focus upon ourselves. We have our own problem, and our problem is American slavery. How dare we say that we want to be free from Great Britain, but we have slavery? How dare those African American soldiers who fought in World War II would return home. Some of them were actually killed in the South, hanged in the South, when they wore their American uniform and dared to return to their hometowns in 1945. So the Reforming Party was wanting to focus on this. An interesting person was Isaac Backus, a Baptist. I've talked about the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians, but Isaac Backus said, wait a second, you guys also want to remain established. So the Congregationalist Church, even though the First Amendment said we'll no longer have an established religion, the Congregationalists remained established in Connecticut till 1818. They remained established in Massachusetts till 1833. They were what today we would call, they were the elites. And they liked their elite position. They liked the taxes that were spent to support their clergy. And Isaac Backus said, well, if you're against the establishment of Great Britain, why are you not against the establishment that's already taking place within our country? And so as a Baptist, he said, I challenge the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians to step back. And that became part, remember when we read the book on the separation of church and state, of the separation of church and state. No religious tradition, Presbyterian Congregational Church of England, should have establishment, should have privilege in this society. He called for an end of establishment. Jacob Green was a Presbyterian minister who for a while served as president of Princeton, was a founding trustee, and this is what he said. While I am obliged to point out many crying sins among us, I cannot help animating you from consideration that we are engaged in a glorious cause. This is the American Revolution. In this cause, I would have encouraged and be emboldened, although I must lead your thoughts to some disagreeable subjects. there are sins among us. God is angry and is contending with us. So right in the middle of the American Revolution, not really seen in the Ken Burns documentary, are religious preachers who are saying, we've got some sins of our own. Don't simply point the finger at Great Britain. The Loyalists were the third. This is an interesting question. How many were the Loyalists? We think they were maybe 20%, maybe 25%. Well, what was their argument? I did like the way that the American Revolution documentary pointed up the Loyalists. Wasn't it fascinating to find out how 2/3 of the Indians joined the British cause and what African Americans might have thought about the British point of view? I mean, nobody knew how this war was going to end. Nobody understood that this might create a new nation. So that was a very good part, I thought, of the documentary. Well, the Loyalist Party had three different basic arguments. The English monarchy, number one, is better than the untried American democracy. The documentary says again, careful, democracy was a word of kind of, extremism. This is kind of, wow, these are wild-eyed people. What's that going to look like? Give the vote to the people? They were against this untried democracy. It is much safer to remain with what we already know, which is the monarchy. And then the second argument was that individuals therefore had a right to obey the ruler. A right to obey the ruler. And thirdly, the Bible condemned the actions of the patriots. Because, and they quoted Romans 12:1 and 2, we are to obey the rulers. It's fascinating to me how not many years later, of course, the Bible was used to support slavery. The Bible has been used to support many things. It's also been used as a sword of liberation. And finally, there was the pacifist response. These were the Quakers, the Mennonites, Church of the Brethren, Moravians. They argued that we should not serve in the military, we should not pay war taxes, we should not pay any taxes, and they refused to sign some of the loyalty oaths that were circulating through the revolutionary years. So I want to conclude by asking a couple of questions for us to consider in your comments and questions. First of all, what did the American Revolution do to Christians and the churches, or what did Christians and the churches do to the American Revolution? How did they interact with each other? But the contemporary question is, how is America 2026 influencing Christians and the churches? I'm fully aware, Cynthia and I had lunch on Thursday with one of her old friends from USC, and the gentleman said, and I fully understand, he said, I can't watch the news anymore. It's so terrible. I just can't watch it. It's just driving me to distraction. So the idea that perhaps we can't watch it anymore, or what's going on we accept as normal, we can no longer resist or reject, that might be what's really happening for some of us. I remember one of my mentors when I was a young minister said, we cannot hide out in the church. I know that we come to the church sometimes so we don't have to listen to the news or we don't have to read the newspaper, but I also don't think we can hide out in the church. I'm so proud and pleased that this church wants to talk about these important issues that are issues that concern all of us. The second one might be, how are Christians and churches influencing America in 2026? What are we saying about what is happening in Minneapolis? What are we saying about how we understand what is happening in our country? 2026 is going to be a very, very important year because all of these different ideas, all of these different lenses, all the different ways that we understand American history are going to be right out there in front of us. So we have a decision to make. Some years ago, I taught in the history department at UCLA, and I was asked to teach what they call historiography. And this was a class for senior history majors. And so I picked out about 7 books. Can you imagine people actually read 7 books back then? And I would read a book. I read one book that was a great book on the environment. And so I asked the students as they were reading the book, what do you think is the point of view or the lens of the author? They didn't know what I was asking. They were history majors. Well, this is what she said. No, I don't mean what she said. I said, what is her point of view? So everybody has a point of view. I have a point of view. You have a point of view. And the question we're asking in these 5 weeks together is, what is the lens by which we will approach America at 250? We begin with the American Revolution to suggest that in that great epical event, Christians had a remarkable role to play, notwithstanding the wonderful Ken Burns documentary. We need to hear that story and understand how Christians acted at that pivotal time, which then forces us to ask the question, how will we act in this pivotal time? Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. We're going to find our places next. Jessie is going to grab a microphone. She'll be the MC to walk through the room to take your questions. If Ron and I are going to take our seats up here on the chairs, it's always nice to have an actual historian telling us about history rather than pretend historians. Isn't history always more complicated than we recall? Always more complicated than the amateurs want to make it. My hunch is there is not one opinion in this room. My hunch is there are at least 4 opinions, maybe 100 opinions. And it's helpful to realize that in the history of America, people had different opinions and different approaches. So we've got a chance here, at least for 15 minutes, maybe all the way 30 minutes, to hear your questions of Ron. And I do ask that you lean toward question. Ron's okay with statements. I tend to prefer questions because he's the expert. Jessie is going to be the MC. So if you're interested in interaction with Ron and me, just raise your hand and Jessie will come and find you. Ron, let's make our way to the seats up here. Several weeks ago, Ron took me to a basketball game to see Gonzaga play Pepperdine. And we had to go 1 seat above this in order to get our seats. We were like mid-court and only 4 rows up. It was awesome. But we'll make ourselves comfortable here. And if you're interested, just raise your hand and Jessie will make her way to you.
Thank you. Dr. White, let me ask you, who are the current political leaders in the United States that you look up to and trust?
The next question.
You're always creating problems, Dean.
Gosh. Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness. Oh. I'll answer it this way. The Constitution has 3 parts. Part 1 is not the presidency. Part 1 is the legislature. And the legislature is missing in action. The legislature is missing in action. And very self-consciously did they frame that Constitution. They were terribly afraid of a king. They had had a king. They didn't want the president to become a king, and so they wanted the legislature to be the first part of the Constitution, and the president would be the second part of the Constitution. I'm writing, as Stuart mentioned, this biography of John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams always called him King Andrew, King Andrew. So I think that I can't really answer the question. I'm disappointed in a way that I can't say something more specific to that. I hope there will be people who are willing to rise up. I have the feeling that a lot of people are just keeping their heads ducked because they know if they do rise up, they will then be the subject of criticism. I hope as the years go on, maybe beyond 2026, we'll begin to see some of these people rise. I'm sorry for ducking out.
History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. I find myself looking to different periods within both American and European history for what's rhyming right now. Ron, where do you look in the past for some guidance about the future.
Well, in our congregation here, we have studied in the past year or two what's called the Barmen Declaration. I want to be very careful. I'm not equating Nazism with what's happening today. But in 1933, when Hitler rose to power, I didn't understand for a long, long, long time he rose to power as an anti-communist. And so the Germans voted for him, not that they were pleased with him, but they were much more fearful of the communists. The greatest theologian of the 20th century, Karl Barth, was a victim of Nazism and finally escaped and went into Switzerland where he spoke. And then in 1962 he came to the United States, and as a student at Princeton Seminary I was privileged to hear him. And the question was asked of him, well, you were so critical of Nazism. Why are you not critical of communism? Well, he said, I'm not critical of communism because it's quite obvious that they're against the Christian faith. What I am most fearful of is a group that tries to take within itself the Christian faith, tries to have access to power. Hitler was so smart, he gave access to power to what he called the German Christians. And this is what I'm most fearful of, that a political party will align itself with the church, and therefore the church will not be able or willing to criticize the political party. He said, I'm much more fearful of that kind of movement than communism. So the Barmen Declaration was done in 1933, and it had 6 different points. It said, if this is true, then this is false. And I love to tell the story of Louis Evans Jr., who was the pastor of the Bel Air Presbyterian Church and then at the National Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. The John Birch Society was founded in San Marino. And one Sunday morning at the Bel Air Church, as Louis walked into the sanctuary, on every single seat was a pamphlet of the John Birch Society. Every single seat. What was he about to do? He, in an amazing moment, picked up the John Birch Society in one hand and the Bible in the other and said, if this is true, the Bible, then this is false. 4 families left the church by 12 o'clock that day. If this is true, then this is false. So there is a moment where I think then that's the kind of model I would say, if this is true, then this is false, that I think we can look to. Yeah.
Hello. I was just wondering if you had read the book Letters to the American Church by Eric Metaxas and how this plays in this.
I have not read that, but somehow, to my surprise, Eric Metaxas invited me to be a guest on his program in New York City. And I was there about 15 months ago. And Eric Metaxas is a remarkable person, a very brilliant person, but somehow he is steered off to the side. He's written a book by Bonhoeffer, for example, that those who know Bonhoeffer do not appreciate at all. And he has said, I'm willing to die for Donald Trump. So he has become a very, very true believer. And I find some of his thinking and reasoning very difficult to understand. Yeah.
You know, while Jessie's making her way, I'd like to add a point about Barmen that corresponds to what Ron was saying is one thing that was crucial about the Barmen Declaration, it was confessional. It wasn't pointing the finger at the nation. It was the church confessing its complicity in the years before 1934 with Hitler and his program. And so it was, first of all, an admission, as he's been encouraging us to do, to name the things that we have done that are complicit with anti-kingdom values and which don't bear witness to the lordship of Jesus. That was one thing that set Barmen apart from the 75 other confessions that had been written in Germany in the couple of years before then. And so that will be a continuing theme as we study America at 250, is telling history honestly which always includes our confessions of the ways in which we need to reform our ways.
Nancy?
Yes, I have a question. Given that many, many countries have church and state vying for the loyalties of their people, I'm thinking of Thomas à Becket and Henry, for instance. What in the United States struggle to settle this relationship is unique to the United States?
You're saying within the sort of larger frame of history, what is unique to the United States? Yeah. I think what's really wonderful about the United States was actually articulated wonderfully well by the Prime Minister of Canada last week. He talked about the fact that diversity is a good thing, that pluralism is a good thing, that we can all live together with different points of view, and we can appreciate each other and we can respect each other. How this has arisen in the United States is almost a mystery to some of us. We are not, in some ways, a part of the ethnic rivalries that we see in Europe. I guess the strain of what we now call populism has been there all the time, but we refuse to see it. That there were issues within us, as not simply as a nation, but also in a church. There were parts of us that were really kind of racist or bigoted that they have now been allowed to come to the surface, and it sort of shocked us that some of these attitudes are there. It's a long answer. I need a longer answer. I'm not answering as well as I could, but thank you for the question, Nancy. Let me suggest as we pause and she moves the microphone is that, one of the things we want to do in these 5 weeks is suggest some of our readings. My wife, Cynthia, has been reading a great book by Joseph Ellis on George Washington. You will remember that Joseph Ellis is one of the best commentators on Ken Burns' Civil War documentary. And we're going to be talking about George Washington, who easily could have become king, who easily could have served a third or fourth term, but stepped away. And I really recommend this. It's an older biography, but Joseph Ellis is one of our best historians, and his biography of George Washington is terrific. The books that I'm most captivated by is Rick Atkinson's The British Are Coming. He's also one of the major commentators in the documentary. He's writing a 3-volume trilogy. The first volume is this one, The War for America, Lexington to Princeton, 1775 to 1777. If you go to Vroman's, he's signed all of his books. The second one is now in hardback. The third one is about to come out. I read people not simply for the subject, but their writing. This man is an amazing writer. And if you listen to the documentary, you will hear him as an amazing commentator. The British Are Coming, Rick Atkinson. I'll put this over on the table. Don't take my copy. And this is a great book to read for America 250. Yes.
Rick Atkinson, when is the next Ron White book? What will the subject be and why?
Well, thank you for the question. I'm writing about a third president. I've written about Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant. I'm writing about John Quincy Adams. He was the son of John Adams, the 6th president of the United States. And I'm talking about what I call his third act. Some of us in this room this afternoon are in our third act. By that I mean in our 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so he did something that no other president has ever done before or after. He served in elective office after his presidency. He was not a successful president, but he served 6 different ambassadorships when he was a young man. He then was, I think, our greatest Secretary of State. He was elected president, and then he thought he was retiring, and he was elected by the people of Massachusetts to Congress. His wife didn't want him to do that. She said, I'm not going back to Washington again. And his son, Charles, said, you're going to demean yourself by becoming a lowly congressman. And he served 17 years in Congress. He died in February 1848, his last words were, "The end of earth, the end of earth." And one of the men, young men, a part of the committee that would plan the funeral, was a first-term congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. So I'm writing the story of John Quincy Adams. The best part about him that I like is he started a diary at age 12. He wrote 16,000 pages of his diary. And he wrote in small handwriting so he could put 600 words on a page. And I'll just give you one glimpse. He liked to attend the Presbyterian Church in Washington, but he had taught oratory at Harvard, so he could be pretty crisp with ministers. And on a Christmas Sunday, he heard Dr. Smith preach at Second Presbyterian. The text was Luke chapter 2. And he says in his diary that day, "Isn't this the most beautiful text?" The evangelist lifts up this wonderful story of Jesus. And later on, the Apostle Paul will elaborate on it. He said, as for Dr. Smith, the Presbyterian minister, he was cold and boring. He was cold and boring.
So Ron White, a gift to the rest of us, reads 16,000 pages of diary for gems like this. By the book.
Yeah.
We've got a question over here, Phil.
Got a lot of questions, comments. Yeah.
I'm coming.
Phil. I see you coming. Thank you, Phil.
Ron, I was wondering if you could compare and contrast where we are at the semi-quincentennial. Did I get that right? Semi-quincentennial?
Yeah.
Versus where we were 50 years ago. And I'm just a glance around the room. I think we pretty much all in the room remember 50 years ago. Anyway, semi-quincentennial versus the bicentennial, kind of on the through line of the topics you've been talking about today.
Well, I skipped over that in the handout. I apologize for that. Think back of that, if you remember. Today, this year, the 4th of July, will feature a prize fight at the White House. Absolutely, there'll be a prize fight, a boxing match. Mm-hmm. In 1976, remember, where did it take place? The Statue of Liberty. What did Ronald Reagan lift up? A land of immigrants. Give me your tired, give me your poor. He quoted John Winthrop, the first governor of Massachusetts, "We shall be a city set upon a hill." So in your handout, you read John Winthrop's words. He was a layman. He came with his congregation, landed off the coast of New England, June 12, 1630, and before he let anybody disembark, he preached a sermon. And in that sermon, he said, whatever we shall be for each other. Whatever we shall do together. If we mourn, we will mourn together. If we rejoice, we will rejoice together. And he started out by saying, if we do not do these things, this will be a shipwreck. And he understood this was going to be so difficult. Many people would die within the first year, but we could only do that together. I tell you, I look back upon that and think this is pretty great. A couple of years ago, Cynthia and I were in Kennebunkport in Maine, and if you go through the gift shops there's a big postcard of George W. Bush. And at the bottom it says, "Do you miss me now?" Do you miss me now? So I don't want to minimize the problems that were taking place. We'd overcome Watergate. We were in the midst of the Vietnam War. But government was mostly accepted. The press was mostly accepted. Churches were mostly accepted. It was a different time. And this is where I say the silent artillery of time. At that luncheon on Thursday, Cynthia's friend John said, I fear for my granddaughter who's 8 years old. What kind of a country is she inheriting, and what will her values be? What will be the things that have experienced her or influenced her? Or will it be all the good things that many of us experienced, or will it be the controversy, the kind of raw politics that is tearing us apart? Yeah.
Joseph Ellis recently published another book that I ran into called The Great Contradiction of the Founding Fathers. And it's called An American Tragedy. I'm paraphrasing it, but he points out two things. There's another original sin, which is how we treated the American Indians. And, as you said, George Washington had a lot to do with the initiation of how the Northwest Territories were taken from the nations up in the Canadian border area. But the other thing he points out is we wouldn't be here as a country if they didn't kick slavery down the road. That was just an impossible compromise that was painful, but without it, we wouldn't be here. It's really interesting to think about that.
Thank you. That's really good. And as Cynthia has been reading to me the Joseph Ellis book on George Washington, here we have a wealthy, landed person in Virginia who has 300 slaves. But we need to know that he never allowed the slave families, the husband and the wife, to be separated, which was a common practice. He never allowed older slaves to be sold off. So the question is, what would you and I have done if we lived in Virginia in the 18th century? I'm not in any way justifying George Washington, but I'm also worried about the sort of the moral superiority that we all seem to feel. I wonder how people will think about us 50 years from now with the issues that we failed to address. I had dinner last night with a retired professor from USC, and I never knew this story, but in the middle of Vietnam, he applied to be a conscientious objector. And well, how could you do that? You're not a Quaker. He said, well, I brought my Catholic priest, and they accepted it. And the trap question was, well, what would you have done in World War II? And his answer was, I don't know. I wasn't there. I can't possibly answer that question. All I can tell you is I'm not going to fight in any future wars. And they validated him as a conscientious objector. So it is the great contradiction. Absolutely it is. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, these men had slaves. John Quincy Adams was the person who brought all these petitions forward in Congress against slavery, but then he said, but I'm not against doing away with slavery in the District of Columbia, because if we do that, it'll destroy the whole country. It will bring about a civil war, and I don't think we're quite ready for that yet. So it is the great contradiction. My concern today is, as I started out by talking about the exhibits in Philadelphia, is we don't want to talk about slavery. 3 weeks ago I heard, I won't tell you who someone said this, he said, well, a lot of white people were hurt in the civil rights movement. I've heard Martin Luther King denigrated. I've heard Eric Metaxas denigrate Martin Luther King, denigrate the civil rights movement. So it is the great contradiction. We have never yet fully settled it, and we cannot escape it. We need to deal with it. So I'm glad that Joseph Ellis wrote this book. Yeah.
And Ron, this is one reason why I'm grateful for you in this community and why I'm grateful for your participation in this. The Bible is the signal example of people telling their history honestly. One cannot read from Genesis through Revelation and not see that an honest assessment of the sins of the people is offered in the confidence of God's mercy and in the trust in God's sanctifying power. And I think the church has that to offer wherever it is, whatever country it's lodged in. For us, that's this country, to set an example of honesty as we tell our history, an example of faith that we're not going to be destroyed if we acknowledge the ways in which we sin and stray from the way that God has in store for us, and that we can speak that truth with humility and in confidence that we can be better than we are now. And that's one of the reasons why I value gatherings like this and why I think gatherings such as this are so important for our nation right now. Because on the one hand, it's nothing but bashing the past of the nation, and on the other hand, it's whitewashing the past of the nation. Nobody's life is like that, really. You know, an honest assessment of life is we're sinners saved by grace. who need the grace of God going forward and therefore can tell the truth.
I'm so impressed by Jonas's story. Jonas is our director of digital ministries here at San Marino. Jonas told me that as a child growing up in Germany, he went to 2 death camps. Every child in Germany goes to the death camp. You cannot walk away from this. You cannot say, I was not born. I wish every child could go to the hanging monument in Montgomery, Alabama, and see all of these counties throughout the South, every one of them naming every single person who was hanged in this county, in this county, in this county, in this county, in this county. This is not to say that we're an evil country, but this is part of who our history is. Now, the documents that we're going to be talking about, especially the Declaration, is an aspirational document. It's not a finished document. Thomas Jefferson says 20 years later, we never thought that we finished this with a Declaration or with a Constitution. This has to continually be brought anew and written anew and understood anew. And that's what we have the chance to do in 2250.
We have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Don't want to talk too long here.
See a hand there, Randy, here.
Thanks. Appreciate learning about the 4 schools of thought.
Yes.
Okay. The 4 schools of thought, or the 4 factions, the loyalists.
Yeah.
How long did it take to, after the Revolutionary War, for those factions to find kinship again?
Wonderful question. If there were those 4 factions, how long did it take for them to kind of meld together as a nation, as a new nation? That's a story that we often haven't given enough attention to. Obviously, most of the loyalists left, but that became a real issue. The church actually began to renew itself in the early part of the 19th century. And what it did was, it was disestablished. This is what I'm going to talk about at the Cornerstone Society on February 22nd. But a whole group of new voluntary organizations began to sprout up. The American Bible Society, the American Anti-Slavery Society, the American Education Society, the American Peace Society, the Sunday School Movement. And these voluntary organizations are what made this country so powerful. In the 20th century, we would think of Red Cross or all these other things. And this is where people who thought that the church would go down when it was disestablished actually went up, because we depend upon our voluntarism. It's not simply the clergy, it's the volunteers of lay persons that begins to grow the church. And so the church explodes in the 1810s, 20s, 30s, and 40s. And there's a second Great Awakening. The first Great Awakening that I talked about, the intercolonial movement, is basically mostly a religious movement. The second Great Awakening embraces all of these reform movements much broader and wider than the Great Awakening.
There's been a drift in religion, I think, in the U.S., and I'm wondering what you think about the decline of the mainline churches and the exodus that continues in the world against the mainline, and how does that affect politics?
Wow, what a wonderful question or comment. The comment that there's been a decline in the so-called mainline churches, and how does that affect our politics? I think just in recent years, I think COVID has done a real number on our churches. And the decline that we need to understand is not simply among the churches. It's in the Rotary Club, the Kiwanis Club, the Lions Club. The whole idea that we would take our time to gather together, to sit in a meeting for an hour or an hour and a half, for many younger people to be away from their phone for an hour or an hour and a half is simply not possible. But we also, as Stuart has suggested, we have to look at ourselves and said, well, what have we been missing here? Those groups who are enjoying a resurgence seem to be much more experiential. They are touching into people's experiences. They're maybe connecting to kind of modern culture in a way that the so-called old line, the Presbyterian, Congregational, Lutheran, even Methodist, even Baptist, even the Southern Baptist denomination is losing members. The Presbyterian Church, when it re-emerged in 1983, the two branches that had divided in the Civil War, Southern and Northern, had over 4 million members. Today it has 1 million members. We have lost a great deal. On the other hand, I'm pleased to be a part of this congregation, which I think is offering something of content, of experience, and a willingness to hear each other's voices, even when we may not agree with each other. But this is a challenging time. What we call the nones, those who have no particular religious affiliation, is a real challenge. And yet there's also evidences of young people who are rediscovering the Christian faith and perhaps can help renew who we are. Often churches say, well, we need to change. We need to have more young people, but we don't really want to change. So that's a challenge for us. Do we want to say anything about what we're going forward?
Yes. In March the 15th, if you are interested, the Walter Isaacson's book, The Greatest Sentence Ever Written, will kind of be our focus, and I'll take the lead on that one and discuss that particular aspect of America's founding. Where does that phrase come from, that all men are created equal? How complicated was the conversation behind that sentence being written and edited? And the following month, in April, Jesse will take the lead and lift up some voices of people who were more than happy to say the contrary, that all men are not created equal, because it was a subject of some disagreement even then, that conviction. So that's where we will focus in the next two sessions, March the 15th and on April the 19th.
And then I'm going to do the fourth one.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, then Ron's going to speak on Abraham Lincoln.
This
Yeah.
might surprise you. It surprised me that in a way the Declaration of Independence sort of fell into disuse by the 1830s or 1840s. It was simply an historical document that celebrated our dissolution of our relationship with Great Britain, and then Abraham Lincoln reclaimed it. And when he came into his political maturity, he was the one who reclaimed the Declaration of Independence as an aspirational document. It was a reforming document. It had not done its work in 1776. It still needed to do its work in 1860, and that this in some ways, if it even meant civil war, this was what had to take place. So I want to tell the story of how Abraham Lincoln reclaimed the Declaration of Independence for a new generation of Americans.
And Ron, you mentioned the Cornerstone Society event on February the 22nd. Could you plug that one more time?
Okay.
When, where? Yeah.
Well, this is a society for people who have give to this church in their wills, and I've been asked to speak to it at the San Gabriel Country Club on February 22nd. And I'm going to talk about that period after the American Revolution and how this second Great Awakening began to re-energize both the American Republic and the American churches. What was it? How did it do it?
So we hope you'll look for the invitation to that and register to attend. And the big gift is that you get to hear Ron speak yet again. Thanks for your participation today and your involvement. Again, if we don't have your contact information and you would like us to have it, we have several sheets of paper there where you can sign your name and your email address, and we'll be able to communicate with you going forward. We're happy to get feedback all the time. If you have questions or further, interest from Ron or complaints or anything, feel free to be in touch with us. We hope that you will be back with us on March the 15th, same bat time, same bat station. I'll invite you, if you are able, to stand, and we will conclude with prayer. Eternal God, thank you. Thank you for giving us life, and thank you for giving us the church as our people, and thank you for giving us a land in which to live, a land in which we learn what it means to love our neighbor as ourselves. We pray for our land this day. for our president and for our legislature. We pray for all those who are charged with the responsibility of order and peace and justice. And we pray for ourselves as citizens, that we would be faithful to you first of all, that we would bear witness to the lordship of Jesus, that we would speak the truth in love, and that we would trust your saving power. Come, Lord Jesus Christ, in the grace of your Spirit, and sanctify us wholly. We pray in the strong name of the Trinity. Amen. Thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon. Go Rams.